All right, guys, welcome to the show. I got an awesome one for you today. So I hope everybody had some nice time off for Christmas. I hope you get some nice time off for New Year's, but we got a lot to get into today. We're playing catch-up since I myself had some time off. By the way, shout out to my amazing wife. The Christmas present that she got for me was like, not front row, but one row back of very front row tickets to the Wizards versus Knicks game. And I got to see Jalen Brunson drop 55 points, dog, in a battle that went to overtime. It was awesome, and I kind of lost my voice a little bit from screaming so much. The New York came out of me when I was cheering for the Knicks. And by the way, the Capital One Arena in D.C. was more like Madison Square Garden than it was like an arena in D.C. You probably, I want to say it was like 50% Knick fans there, maybe more. So anyway, that was a lot of fun. Best birthday present ever. So in just a second, we'll get to the big news. I'll break it down for you. Jimmy Carter has passed away at the age of 100. I'm going to give you the truth about Jimmy Carter and his legacy. There's a lot of hot takes out there. I'm going to deliver the straight dope to you. So we'll talk about that. I'll also give you Joe Biden drops his hottest take of all time, and nobody has ever been more wrong than the thing that he says. This is amazing. This is going to blow your mind when we talk about it. And of course, Elon Musk is having a legendary crash out right now where he's continuing to feud with MAGA. He can't help himself. Elon, do yourself a favor. Log off, bitch. Go touch grass. Stop reading everybody shitting on you. By the way, I'm waiting. Any minute now, Elon is gonna ban my ass from Twitter. I'm about to start a blue sky up in a little bit because I have no doubt he's going to axe me at some point because I spend half my time on Twitter calling for Elon Musk to be deported. So we'll get to all that stuff and more. By the way, subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet. Deeply, deeply appreciated. It helps out massively in the algorithm. And of course, thank you to everybody who makes this show work by supporting it on Patreon. That link's below. Or tipping with the thanks button on YouTube. That's also below right here. Couldn't do it without you guys. And remember, we are real independent media, not fake independent media. It means I've never had a conversation with an advertiser or a corporation or foreign government or a billionaire, and I never will. You guys keep me honest. I've really insulated us from any malincentives, and I'm very, very proud of that. All right, let's go ahead and dive into it. So Jimmy Carter just passed away. I'm going to get to some video clips in a little bit, some interesting things about his legacy and interesting positions he's taken that make him quite different from other former presidents, right? I mean, I think the biggest takeaway when it comes to Jimmy Carter, what everybody will agree to, is that whatever you think of his time in office, and we'll get into that in a little bit, when he left the White House, he might be the only living president, now he's not living anymore, but you get the point, that didn't cash out, right? Or cash in, I guess you could say. He's the only one who wasn't like chasing money. He's the only one who actually tried to do something positive with himself when he left office and like make the world a better place. Okay, so to break it down for you, so Jimmy Carter, he was in the military, he was in submarines, he grew up in rural Georgia. He was a peanut farmer. There's the famous stories of, when he was president, he had to sell his peanut farm because it set up the appearance of impropriety and corruption and pay to play because he has this business. You could have foreign governments or billionaires, give money to him through his peanut farm. So he said, look, we don't want any conflicts of interest. He ended up selling his peanut farm. Obviously, that stands in stark contrast to Donald Trump, for example, who made $160 million from foreign governments when he was president, working on a deal with Saudi Arabia and the government of Oman and many other countries right now as we speak, just cashing in big time from being a former president and about to be the president again. Jimmy Carter could not be more different. So he got into politics, and this is incredible, guys, by opposing segregation. Now, that might sound like, well, duh, that's a good thing. Understand, he was 100 years old. So in the late 1920s and early 1930s, he's growing up as a white boy in rural Georgia, and he's opposed to racial segregation. That's kind of a big deal, because that is a real diamond in the rough. I'm sure most rural white boys from Georgia growing up in the late 1920s, they're probably the most racist people you've ever heard in your life talk about any topic ever. He somehow escaped that and got into politics by opposing segregation. So when he was in office, let's run through some of the positive things he did while in office. First of all, he pardoned all Vietnam draft dodgers, which is, of course, incredibly based. We should have never done the Vietnam War. There are just so many dead Vietnamese civilians as a direct result of that. What was it? I think it's about 50,000 or maybe more U.S. soldiers who died in that. Just, it never should have happened, never should have been done. It was absolutely horrific. Total war of aggression. And he pardoned every single Vietnam draft dodger. Again, incredibly based. He also created the Department of Energy and the Department of Education. Mega based. I know that the right-wingers would say this makes him bad. Okay. I think it pretty clearly makes him good, the Department of Energy and Education. There's the famous story of him installing solar panels at the White House, trying to not only talk the talk, but walk the walk when it came to renewable energy. He raised the minimum wage as president. Very famously for foreign policy, he ended up getting peace between Egypt and Israel, peace that still stands to this day. He gave the Panama Canal back to Panama. He negotiated a nuclear treaty with the Soviet Union. He normalized relations with China. So he tried his best foreign policy-wise to really lean on diplomacy. And there were, of course, some good things domestically that, we just talked about some of them there. But, and now we discuss the bad, Jimmy Carter was honestly the beginning of the neoliberal era, right? So up until Carter, you had this default consensus that, well, of course, the government can be used for good economically and domestically. There was this idea of like, yeah, everybody's a New Dealer, right? So everybody supports basic government programs to try to alleviate poverty, help out with healthcare, etc., provide jobs, have the government basically be the employer of last resort when we have a recession or a depression. Everybody up to that point, the consensus was FDR's New Deal consensus, and even Republicans couldn't get away with, wanting to slash government. Government was understood as a potential force for good that we should utilize, right? But he was the beginning of that trend changing. And then, of course, it led to Ronald Reagan, who really went extreme in that direction, right? So, for example, Jimmy Carter deregulated the airline industry. He deregulated trucking and railroads and energy. And this was the seeds that were planted for the horrific next generation of American politics, which we are still dealing with to this day, namely the neoliberal era and basically the dominance of the right-wing economic worldview where privatization is always the way to go. Again, we're still dealing with the fallouts of this today. Bill Clinton was a neoliberal. Barack Obama was a neoliberal, although not as extreme as Bill Clinton. Joe Biden, elements of neoliberalism, but there has been some ways in which he's broken from neoliberalism and reverted back to some semblance of New Deal politics. Like, for example, if we had gotten Build Back Better passed, that would have been more of an iteration of FDR-style politics and not Ronald Reagan politics. And oh, would you look at that? It's a shame Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema ended up killing that, which was absolutely horrific, right? So you have all that. Now, the other thing is when he was in there, he faced stagflation, and that, of course, is a killer for any presidency. And his reaction to that was to cut inflation, but create a recession and increase unemployment with tight monetary policy, right? So he's gotten a lot of criticism about that over the years, basically a planned recession to try to get inflation under control. He liberalized trade. Again, that's not good. That leads to the era of outsourcing and the manufacturing base in the U.S. being destroyed. And then, of course, you have, this is probably the number one thing that people talk about when they bring up Jimmy Carter, is the Iran hostage crisis, right? And on that one, man, any people who know the backstory would understand, he is not at fault. He is not to blame. He honestly did everything right when it comes to the Iran hostage crisis. You just genuinely have a situation where Ronald Reagan, his campaign at the time, and the Republicans literally committed treason to try to stab Jimmy Carter in the back. So for those of you who don't know this story, it's a dark one, and, big-time political junkies know this story, but what happened was Carter and his team were negotiating with Iran to try to get them to give up the American hostages. And they were talking every day. They were getting the details of the deal down. It was night and day. That's all they were focused on. They were trying to bring these Americans home. And then what happened was the Reagan campaign had backdoor communications to the government of Iran and said to the government of Iran, don't release them. Don't release them to hurt Carter's chances to get reelected. And then when Reagan wins, then you can release them. And so the mythology goes, oh, Jimmy Carter was weak and pathetic, and Ronald Reagan, when he got in there, they were so scared of him that they released the hostages on day one when Ronald Reagan was sworn in. So in this right-wing mythology, it's like Ronald Reagan is so amazing and so incredible and such a strong man that Iran was so scared they released the hostages on day one when he got in there. When the fact of the matter is, Reagan's campaign was literally negotiating behind the scenes and committing treason against the United States, screwing over those hostages, and telling Iran, hold the hostages longer until, so it hurts Carter and Reagan wins, and then release them when Reagan gets in there. And they had some sort of a deal that they cut, and that's exactly what Iran did. And so that, I mean, absolutely devastating story, and it just really goes to set the tone for what the rest of the Reagan years were like. I mean, just a slimy, weaselly, two-faced son of a bitch who betrayed his country to try to get in power, right? So, all right, now let's dive into some specific issues here. On the issue of money in politics, Jimmy Carter, especially in his old age, has been crystal clear. His thoughts. Watch this.
That's true. I think that massive use of money and the power that goes to the people who give a lot of money to a candidate has resulted in this vast disparity in income in America, and has resulted in the polarization more than any other single factor.
And corrupted politics?
I think it's corrupted in a way, although I can't say against the law, because the law is established by the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court seems to be eager to see rich people become more powerful, and to see corporations become more powerful than individuals with their previous rulings. So I think with the presently constituted Supreme Court, there's very little chance that we'll see money removed from politics.
You also have this. Jimmy Carter. U.S. is an oligarchy with unlimited political bribery. The 39th president said the Citizens United ruling violates the essence of what made America a great country in its political system. So he was direct. U.S. is an oligarchy with unlimited political bribery. And by the way, it was under Carter that you began to see the first Supreme Court decisions that laid the groundwork and the framework for money to be considered free speech. The first one was in the mid-1970s, I think. And then from there were a number of other court cases that really solidified this notion that money is speech. Therefore, if you're a billionaire robber baron oligarch, you have a louder voice in what's supposed to be a democracy compared to some grandma from Cleveland who donates $5 to her favorite politician, right? So that's him on money in politics, pretty solid. Now, this issue of Israel-Palestine, this is one he was more clear than any other president. Certainly in his time post-presidency, he kept it real on this issue. Let's listen.
I think more than any other episode or incident or situation on earth, this is the most directly affecting adversely America in not bringing peace to Israel and justice and peace to the Palestinians, yes.
You obviously were very successful in bringing peace with Israel and Egypt. Can any deal be done that doesn't involve sitting across a table with Hamas?
I've met several times with Hamas leadership, and I think they are willing to accept Israel to exist peacefully within the 67 borders or some modification of those borders. But the first step has to be to bring Hamas and Fatah together so they can have another honest election. That is a major premise, and I think the 67 borders between the two with some modifications will lead to a two-state solution. Netanyahu now, I believe, has decided unequivocally to move to a one-state solution, which every one of his predecessors in the prime ministership have condemned as a disaster for Israel. And I think Israel is now moving toward a disaster for itself and insisting that all the way from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea has to be Israeli control. The word apartheid is exactly accurate. You know, this is an area that's occupied by two powers. They're now completely separated. The Palestinians can't even ride on the same roads that the Israelis have created or built in Palestinian territory. The Israelis never see a Palestinian except the Israeli soldiers. The Palestinians never see an Israeli except at a distance, except the Israeli soldiers. So within Palestinian territory, they're absolutely and totally separated, much worse than they were in South Africa, by the way. And the other thing is, the other definition of apartheid is one side dominates the other, and the Israelis completely dominate the life of the Palestinian people.
Why don't Americans know what you have seen?
Americans don't want to know, and many Israelis don't want to know. What is going on inside Palestine. It's a terrible human rights persecution that is far transcends what any outsider would imagine. And there are powerful political forces in America that prevents any objective analysis of the problem in the Holy Land. I think it's accurate to say that not a single member of Congress with whom I'm familiar would possibly speak out and call for Israel to withdraw to their legal boundaries or to publicize the plight of the Palestinians, or even to call publicly and repeatedly for good faith peace talks. There hadn't been a day of peace talks now in more than 7 years. So this is a taboo subject, and I would say that if any member of Congress did speak out, as I've just described, they would probably not be back into Congress the next term.
Think of Jamal Bowman, for example. Think of Cory Bush. He's saying, look, the Israel lobby has a tremendous amount of power, and they will try to take you down if you disagree with them. That's exactly right. All right, more. Here he is on MSNBC back in the day.
And I also emphasize the word not, that is peace and not apartheid. That's what I hope to accomplish with this book, is some move toward that goal. But there's no doubt that within the occupied territories, Palestinian land, that there is a horrendous example of apartheid. The occupation of Palestinian land, the confiscation of that land that doesn't belong to Israel, the building of settlements on it, the colonization of that land, and then the connection of those isolated but multiple settlements, more than 200 of them, with each other by highways on which Palestinians can't travel, and quite often where Palestinians cannot even cross. So the persecution of the Palestinians now under the occupied territories, under the occupation forces, is one of the worst examples of human rights deprivation that I know. And I think
even worse, though, than a place like Rwanda?
Yes, I think, yes. You mean now?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, I think
the oppression now of the Israelis, of the Palestinians by the Israelis, is worse than a situation in Africa like the oppression of Rwandans and the Civil War.
I'm not going back into ancient history about Rwanda, but right now, the persecution of the Palestinians is one of the worst examples of human rights abuse I know, because the Palestinians...
When you're talking about right now. You're not talking about, say,
I'm not talking about ancient history,
ago.
no.
Well, Rwanda wasn't ancient history. It was just a few years ago.
You can talk about Rwanda if you want to. I want to talk about Palestine. What is being done to the Palestinians now is horrendous in their own territory by the occupying powers, which is Israel.
This was actually really prescient, because the comparison to Rwanda, I mean, that's effectively what ended up happening, right? There is literally an ongoing genocide right now in Gaza. We've all seen the absolute horror stories. You can't scroll through social media without seeing a kid with their head blown off or their legs blown off. You can't read the news without coming across an article about how kids are needing to have legs and arms amputated with no anesthesia. Kids are being sniped in the face. There's, documented evidence piled the size of Mount Everest. You have literal Nazi-like comments made by Israeli government officials. This stuff is all on the record. They have literal concentration camps where they were graping Palestinians to death with a metal rod, right? They're literally doing a starvation strategy openly for the world to see. And we just got word the other day that there are Palestinian babies who froze to death because of the current situation on the ground in Gaza, brought to you by Israel on purpose, right? So for him to say, we need to talk about this issue, that's totally prescient, because, as bad as Rwanda was, this is effectively, it's a genocide now too. It's a genocide. That's what we're witnessing.
Away all the basic human rights of the Palestinians, as was done in South Africa against the blacks. And I make it very plain in this book that the apartheid is not based on racism, as it was in South Africa, but it's based on the desire of a minority of Israelis to acquire land that belongs to the Palestinians and to retain that land, and then to exclude the Palestinians from their own property and subjugate them so that they can't arouse and demonstrate their disapproval of being robbed of their own property. That's what's happening in the West Bank. And the people in this country, in America, never know about this. They never discuss this. There's no debate about it.
That's right. I mean, the media generally does a pretty poor job. Certainly, cable news does a pretty poor job. There are outlets that do a decent job, and every now and then you get a moment of truth where they let you know how dire the situation is and how disgusting and how grotesque and how deranged it is. But he's right. Now, that's what he said on the issue of Israel-Palestine, particularly since he hasn't been in office. Let me give you the counter argument, though, too, because while he was president, the famous saying is he never fired a shot as president, right? And he talks about how my biggest accomplishment was leaning on diplomacy, is what he says, right? that he believed in peace and he tried to bring about peace through all of his actions in the White House. But there are some examples where that's actually totally not true, right? And it's particularly about the U.S. providing weapons to horrific governments. Now, to be fair to Carter, there were a number of governments that were authoritarian and brutal and violated human rights where he did cut off weapons to them. But there's an important example where that wasn't the case, and I'll let Chomsky lay it out here for you.
Carter increased as the Indonesian atrocities were increasing. They peaked in 1978. Carter's flow of weapons to Indonesia increased when Congress imposed human rights restrictions. By then there was a human rights movement in Congress to block the flow of advanced weaponry to Indonesia. Carter arranged through Mondale, vice president, to get Israel to send U.S. Skyhawks to Indonesia to enable Indonesia to complete what turned out to be near genocide, killing maybe a quarter of the population or something. In the Middle East, Carter just won the Nobel Prize. His great achievement was the Camp David agreements. The Camp David agreements are presented as a diplomatic triumph for the United States. In fact, they were a diplomatic catastrophe. At Camp David, the United States and Israel accepted, finally, Egypt's 1971 offer, which they had then, U.S. had rejected at the time, except that now it was worse from the U.S.-Israeli point of view because it included the Palestinians. In order to get Israel to accept Egypt's 1971 offer, after a major war and atrocities and so on, Carter raised aid, military and other aid to Israel to more than 50% of total aid worldwide. Israel used it at once in exactly the way they said they were going to do, as every sane person knew, as an opportunity to attack their northern neighbor, first in 1978, then in 1982, and to increase integration of the occupied territories. And that's for starters. We can continue.
And here they talk about how the weapons that Carter provided to Indonesia were used for a genocide in East Timor, right? So, yeah, that's pretty devastating. That's pretty devastating right there. Now, this is like the official stuff. We went through the domestic and economic. We went through the foreign policy stuff. But now let's talk a little bit about when he left, when he was a former president. Look at this. In 2015, Jimmy Carter had brain cancer. In 2019, he broke his hip. That same year, at age 95, he fell at home requiring 14 stitches. Despite his injuries, he showed up the next day to help build houses for the Habitat for Humanity. So look, it genuinely is the case with Jimmy Carter that when he left office, he acted more morally and ethically than any president in the modern era. And I don't really think that's debatable. The other thing is, through his Carter Foundation, this might even be his biggest achievement here. He got rid of guinea worm. He nearly eradicated guinea worm. So guinea worm, for those of you who don't know, it's an illness. It's basically like a parasite in the water, and it happens in developing countries. And he decided, well, what if we give, all these developing countries water filtration systems, right? And listen to what happened. When Carter got involved in guinea worm eradication in 1986, there were 3.6 million cases. Now, nearly 4 decades later, that number has plummeted. Between January and early December 2024, there were just 11 human cases of guinea worm reported worldwide. The Carter Center notes that final figures for 2024 won't be available until next year. From 3.6 million cases of guinea worm to just 11 cases of guinea worm. And they go on to explain this is how horrific this disease is. Guinea worms are spread through contaminated drinking water and eating undercooked fish. The female worms, which can be up to 3 feet long once they mature, cause incredibly painful open blisters, usually on the infected person's lower legs and feet, through which the worms emerge. It can take a toll for weeks or months and sometimes permanently, leaving the individual unable to support a family. So he nearly eradicated guinea worm. Here you have a former president who actually gave a shit and wanted to make the world better. And that's what his life was dedicated at post-presidency. There's no doubt about it. Now, again, you want to look during the presidency, he's a very complicated and complex figure. There were awesome things he did. There were horrible things that he did. He helped usher in neoliberalism. He was the real first president that started down this path of privatization, really breaking from the New Deal consensus. That stuff was bad. That stuff was horrible. Economically, he oversaw stagflation, basically created a recession to get inflation under control. That's not so great either. But at the same time, he raised the minimum wage and pardoned all Vietnam draft dodgers, and 90% of the time on foreign policy leaned on diplomacy. By the way, I should point this out too. So the weapons he provided to Indonesia, which were used for a genocide in East Timor, he was asked that question directly by Democracy Now! About his time in office, and basically what the hell, man? What are you doing? Here you are cutting off weapons to all these human rights abusers. Here you are leaning on diplomacy around the entire world. Then you have this one colossal stain on your record where you're providing weapons to a genocidal government. He was asked that question directly, and his response was, look, I got to be honest with you. When you're president, you're dealing with 100 issues every single day. You got stuff coming at you from every which direction. You're trying to do the best you can. And I literally just didn't know. I just didn't know. There'd be a sheet of paper put in front of me that is just sign off on this to give some weapons to our allies, Indonesia. He signs off on it. They end up getting the weapons. And then in retrospect, it's oh shit, those weapons were used to literally massacre innocent people. So that's what he said to Amy Goodman, right to her face. Of course, I would have not done it in retrospect, but I didn't know at the time. I did not know, because unfortunately, you're relying oftentimes on other agencies, and you're relying on the Pentagon, for example. And I mean, this could actually be a clear example of the deep state sort of steering policy in a way where the president wasn't up to snuff on that particular issue, right? But very complex figure when he was president. You have the good stuff, pardoning the Vietnam draft dodgers, creating the Department of Energy and Education, raising the minimum wage, solar panels in the White House, peace between Egypt and Israel, giving back the Panama Canal to Panama, getting nuclear weapons treaties with the Soviet Union. But then, again, the beginning of neoliberalism, which was absolutely horrible, stagflation, the gas crisis, of course, which was hard. You had long lines just to get gas in your car. That had a lot to do with the turmoil in Iran. So he wasn't viewed as the most successful president in the world, but without a doubt, his time after the presidency, he became one of the world's leading humanitarians who actually gave a shit about human rights and was willing to tell the truth more so than almost any other president. So, interesting guy, amazing story, ended up dying at the age of 100, and there you have it. Hey y'all, do me a favor and like and subscribe. It helps out big time in the algorithm. Click the bell as well for notifications when videos drop. And watch that video on screen right now. You know you want to.